Welcome back, everyone. We're ready for another deep dive, and today we're tackling the Enlightenment.
Ooh, exciting.
It is, right? This era between 1650 and 1789.
A period of massive change.
Totally. And we've got a bunch of sources to dig into. Lecture notes, educational goals, even some interesting stuff about museums.
Sounds like we've got our work cut out for us.
We do, but that's the fun part. We're going to figure out why this period is still so important today, why it still matters.
Yeah, it's amazing how much of what we consider modern thought, like the very foundation of how we think today.
Can be traced back to those few decades.
Exactly. It wasn't just new ideas, it was a completely new way of looking at the world.
A total shift in perspective.
Yeah,
Okay, so before we get to all the daring to know stuff and all that,
all that jazz.
right, let's rewind a bit. So the Enlightenment didn't just appear out of thin air, right?
Definitely not. It built on what came before it.
Like what?
The Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution. These movements were all about challenging traditional authorities.
Like the church.
Yes. And they emphasized the power of individual observation and reason.
So like questioning everything they'd been told.
Exactly. Like, hey, wait a minute, maybe the Earth actually revolves around the sun.
And rediscovering all that ancient knowledge.
Right. And figures like Descartes and Locke, they were key in this shift. Descartes, with his focus on rationalism, argued that reason, logic, it's the path to truth.
It all comes down to logic.
Yeah, and Locke, he was all about empiricism. He believed that knowledge comes from our experiences, from what we observe.
From the evidence.
Right. So instead of blindly accepting what they were told, people started saying, hold on, let's test this out, see for ourselves.
Let's experiment. Let's see what happens.
Exactly.
So this shift, it led to that bold new motto for the age. Sapere aude.
Which means dare to know.
Ooh, I like it. Dare to know. It's like a battle cry for knowledge.
It really is.
But what did they actually dare to know? I mean, what were some of the big ideas that came out of this dare to know attitude?
Well, they dared to question everything. Religion, politics, economics, you name it.
They questioned the whole system.
Exactly. For example, with religion, Spinoza came along and said, hey, what if God isn't separate from nature? What if God is inseparable from it?
Whoa, that's a big one.
It was a radical concept, right? It challenged the whole idea of God sitting up in heaven judging us.
Not exactly the classic image we're used to.
Right. Spinoza was suggesting we're all part of this grand, interconnected divine order.
Part of the whole thing.
Yeah. And of course, this ruffled some feathers back then.
I can imagine. So Spinoza was like rethinking the very essence of God. And then you've got Voltaire. He was another major figure in the Enlightenment, right?
Absolutely. Voltaire was a champion of freedom of thought and religious tolerance.
Freedom of thought, very important.
Yeah, he believed in an intelligent designer, a God who created the universe.
So he wasn't rejecting the idea of God altogether.
No, but he argued that organized religion, it often twisted this original intent.
So while Spinoza was rethinking the nature of God, Voltaire was more focused on how humans were interpreting and using religion.
You got it.
It's so interesting how they both dared to question religion, but from these different angles.
Right. It shows that the Enlightenment wasn't about everyone agreeing. It was about debating these different ideas, about exploring all these perspectives.
And this questioning spirit, it didn't stop at religion.
No way. It spread to every area of life, including politics.
Ah, politics. That's where Locke comes in, right? Life, liberty, property, all that good stuff.
You got it. Locke's ideas, they were groundbreaking, revolutionary. He said these rights, they weren't granted by some king or queen.
They were inherent to all humans.
Exactly. And that governments, they couldn't just take these rights away.
That must have freaked out the monarchs.
It was a direct challenge to the entire concept of absolute monarchy. Locke was basically saying, hey, monarchs, your power doesn't come from God.
It comes from the people you govern.
Exactly.
Whoa, talk about shaking things up.
He was laying the foundation for modern democracy. He argued that if a government failed to protect those basic rights,
The people have a right to change it.
or even get rid of it completely, this idea of the social contract between the people and the government,
It's huge.
absolutely fundamental to how we think about government today.
It's not just about individual rights. It's about the very relationship between people and their rulers.
And that was a radical concept at the time.
I bet. And I'm guessing not everyone agreed with Locke's take on this relationship.
You're right. Another major thinker, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he also believed in a social contract.
Oh, okay. So where do they differ?
Well, Rousseau argued that individual freedom, it should sometimes take a backseat to the general will of the entire community.
So more emphasis on the collective good.
Right. He believed in a more direct democracy where everyone participated in making the laws.
Interesting. So for Locke, it's all about protecting individual freedom from an overreaching government. And Rousseau's saying, hey, sometimes we need to give up a little freedom for the good of the group.
Exactly. Two different perspectives on the social contract, but both incredibly influential.
Totally. Okay, so we've got religion and politics being turned upside down. What about economics? Did the Enlightenment thinkers have anything to say about money matters?
No, for sure. That's where Adam Smith comes in.
Adam Smith, famous economist.
His book, The Wealth of Nations, it's basically the Bible of modern economics.
Okay, so what did Adam Smith teach us? What were his big ideas?
He argued that individuals acting in their own self-interest in a free market would actually benefit society as a whole.
So, like, if everyone just focuses on making a buck,
The market will take care of itself.
it all works out in the end. Sounds kind of optimistic, no?
It's definitely a complex idea, and it's been debated ever since, but Smith believed that government intervention in the economy should be kept to a minimum.
Let the market do its thing.
Right. He believed the forces of supply and demand, they would naturally regulate things.
So he's like the intellectual grandfather of capitalism.
You could say that. His ideas had a huge impact on economic thought, and they still shape how we think about markets and the role of government today.
Still relevant after all these years.
Definitely.
Okay, so religion, politics, economics, everything's getting a makeover during the Enlightenment. But what about society as a whole? What did these thinkers believe about how society should function?
Well, they were big believers in the power of knowledge and education.
Knowledge is power.
Exactly. They believed that education could create a better society. The Enlightenment was all about curiosity, about learning and sharing new ideas.
Like a huge thirst for knowledge.
It really was, and that's where the encyclopedia comes in. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, it's like the Google of its day, right? All the world's knowledge in one place.
Exactly. It was this massive project edited by Diderot and D'Alembert. They wanted to gather and spread knowledge on every subject imaginable.
It's incredible to think about the effort that went into creating something like that before the internet.
Right. Talk about dedication to knowledge.
It really shows how important they thought knowledge was.
And this emphasis on learning, it was all tied to the belief that society could improve, that progress was possible.
That we could make things better.
Exactly. The Enlightenment was full of optimism, a belief in human potential, and the idea that we could create a better future.
Sounds nice. But this belief in progress, in questioning everything, I imagine that caused some tension, especially with the folks in charge.
You're absolutely right. These Enlightenment ideas, especially about limiting government power and individual liberties, they posed a direct challenge to the absolute monarchs who were ruling most of Europe at the time.
So how did these rulers react? Did they just embrace these new ideas?
Not quite. Some of them resorted to censorship, trying to suppress these dangerous ideas.
These ideas are too spicy for the people.
But others took a more, shall we say, strategic approach.
Okay, what does that mean?
We call it enlightened absolutism.
Enlightened absolutism. That sounds a bit like having your cake and eating it too.
It kind of was. These rulers, they tried to blend absolute rule with some Enlightenment principles. So maybe they promoted education or economic reforms.
Yeah, the key is the people.
Right. But they weren't about to give up their power.
So they were down with being enlightened as long as it didn't threaten their throne.
Pretty much.
Classic.
Yeah.
Do you have any examples of those rulers?
Yeah, Frederick the Great of Prussia and King Willem I of the Netherlands.
They were both walking this tightrope.
Trying to balance these new ideas with their own authority, it's a fascinating part of the Enlightenment.
It is. These rulers were both influenced by and threatened by these new ideas. It makes you wonder what they really thought about it all.
Right. It was a time of great change, and not everyone was comfortable with it.
And speaking of change, there's this interesting detail in our sources that seems kind of random at first, but it actually connects perfectly to all this Enlightenment stuff.
Oh, this is interesting.
Right. Tell me more.
We're talking about museums.
Museums. Wait, how do museums fit into all this talk of revolution and daring to know?
It's not immediately obvious, but stick with me. The concept of a museum, it goes way back to ancient Greece. Their Maution. It was a place dedicated to the muses,
Muses.
the goddesses of the arts and sciences. So it was a place for inspiration and learning.
A place for the arts and knowledge.
Exactly. And this idea, it got revived during the Renaissance.
With places like the Library of Alexandria.
Exactly. The Library of Alexandria was this incredible collection of knowledge.
It's tragic that it burned down.
It really is. But its spirit lived on. The Enlightenment, with its focus on knowledge, saw the rise of museums as we know them today.
Oh, okay, I see where you're going with this.
Museums became these places to preserve and share knowledge, just like those ancient academies.
They weren't just about old artifacts.
Right. They were about making knowledge accessible to everyone.
Feeding that Enlightenment thirst for knowledge.
Precisely. Museums became hubs for exchanging ideas, for fostering curiosity, and exploring new knowledge.
All those key themes of the Enlightenment.
Exactly.
It's amazing how it all connects. Ancient Greece, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, all these threads woven together.
It shows the power of ideas. The idea of a museum, it started in antiquity, was reborn during the Renaissance, and then took on this new form during the Enlightenment. It's like ideas can evolve and adapt over time.
They can be reinterpreted and reused.
Yeah.
That makes me think about how Enlightenment ideas are still evolving today, how they're still being adapted.
It's a great question and something we're going to explore in more depth.
We are.
But first, I think we need a little break. We'll come back and talk about how the Enlightenment's legacy is still shaping our world today.
Sounds good. We'll be right back after a short break.
It's wild to think about how ideas that were radical back then, like freedom of speech, the separation of powers,
Yeah.
they're like core principles of so many democracies now.
Like those Enlightenment thinkers. They planted these seeds, and now, centuries later.
They've grown into the very fabric of our societies. It's true. But speaking of growth, did everyone benefit equally from this blossoming of new ideas? I mean,
That's an important point.
the Enlightenment wasn't exactly known for being inclusive.
Yeah, you're right. The Enlightenment's vision of progress, it wasn't always inclusive. It often left out women, people of color.
Anyone who didn't fit the mold.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's important to acknowledge that.
Yeah, progress isn't always a straight line. There were definitely blind spots back then, places where those ideals of liberty and equality,
They fell short.
they did.
The Enlightenment's ideals, they were often more aspirational than fully realized, you know?
Yeah, more like goals to strive for.
Right. And it's our responsibility to grapple with that complexity, to learn from the past.
And keep working towards a more just and equitable world.
Exactly. I mean, that's what daring to know is all about, right?
Right. Daring to acknowledge the shortcomings, too.
Absolutely.
So, how do we reconcile those shortcomings with the undeniable impact the Enlightenment has had? I mean, it's not like we can just erase the past. It's about understanding that progress within its context, within the time period it happened.
Yeah, it's a product of its time.
And recognizing that we have a responsibility to continue that work, to keep pushing forward, to address the injustices that still exist today.
To keep working on those blind spots.
Exactly.
So the Enlightenment, it wasn't the finish line.
It was the starting point.
And we're still on that journey, figuring things out as we go.
Absolutely. And the journey continues to unfold as we face the challenges of our own time.
Which brings us back to the mission of this deep dive. We're not just learning about the Enlightenment for fun. We're trying to understand,
Why it still matters.
yeah, why it matters to us today in the 21st century. What can we learn from these thinkers, these debates, these contradictions even,
What can we take from it?
that can help us navigate the world today?
I think that by exploring these ideas, we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves, of how we got here, and the world we live in.
We can see how far we've come and how far we still have to go.
Exactly. We can see the progress and the work that still needs to be done.
It's like looking in the mirror, right? You see the good and the bad.
And you acknowledge that you have the power to change what you see reflected back at you.
That's a great way to put it. The Enlightenment's legacy, it's both a source of inspiration and a call to action.
It reminds us that we have the capacity for reason, for progress,
For creating a better future,
but it also challenges us to be honest about the gaps between our ideals and our realities,
between what we say we believe and what we actually do.
and to make sure those ideals are actually reflected in the world we're building.
It's a challenge for sure.
It is. And that brings us to a final question for you, our listener.
Ooh, hit me with it. Given the Enlightenment's focus on progress, are we in the 21st century truly living up to its ideals?
That's a big one.
It is.
I mean, we've made incredible strides in science and technology, human rights,
but we're also facing these huge challenges.
climate change, social inequality, political polarization. And it's in these moments of challenge that I think the spirit of the Enlightenment becomes even more relevant. It calls on us to use reason, critical thinking, empathy
To navigate these complex issues,
to find solutions.
to shape a more just and sustainable future.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Enlightenment, we want to leave you with that question.
To ponder.
What does it mean to be enlightened in our time? How can we honor this legacy while also addressing the challenges we face today?
It's a question worth thinking about
It is.
because we believe that by engaging in these conversations, by questioning assumptions,
By being critical thinkers,
and by striving for a more just and equitable world,
we're continuing the journey that started centuries ago.
we're carrying that torch forward.
It's about taking that torch of reason and progress and using it to light the way forward.
Even when the path is uncertain, even when it's bumpy.
And remembering that just like those Enlightenment thinkers face pushback, we're going to hit roadblocks too.
But by embracing that spirit of inquiry, by daring to know and challenge what we think we know.
Challenge the status quo.
Exactly.
Mm.
That's how we keep moving forward. It's how we create a world that truly reflects those Enlightenment ideals.
So it's not just about looking back. It's about taking those ideas and
Applying them today.
applying them to the world right now
Yeah.
in the 21st century.
Yeah. And that's why we always encourage you to keep exploring these ideas.
Keep learning.
Right. Pick up a book by Locke or Rousseau or Voltaire.
Ooh, good reads.
Right. Talk about this stuff with your friends.
Have those deep conversations.
And never stop questioning, never stop learning.
Because this whole dare to know thing,
It's not a one-time thing.
it's an ongoing journey.
A lifelong process.
And it's a journey we all get to be a part of.
We're all in this together.
That's a great way to put it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Enlightenment.
It's been fun.
It has. We hope you found it, well, enlightening.
We hope you learned something.
We did too. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling us what you think about this era and what it means for us today. We love hearing from you.
We do.
Until next time, keep those minds curious and stay open to the wonders of knowledge.
See you next time.